Joining, and sorry we're starting a bit late today. So my name is Priya and I was at your stage about over 10 years ago now. And I decided to do medicine, which I studied at Imperial College. I then worked as a junior doctor for a couple of years, and then I studied a master's in neuroscience at Oxford, which I completed last year. And now I'm back working as a doctor, but I also do some part-time research in neuroscience. So this talk is great for anyone considering medicine, biomedical sciences, biology, or biochemistry. But neuroscience is very interesting because often there's also a lot of maths and physics involved. And when you do courses like medicine or biomedical sciences, there's often an option to specialize. And I know neuroscience is one of those options at Oxford. So I'll be giving you a very short introduction on neuroscience and the anatomy of the brain. So just as an introduction, I'll go over what exactly neuroscience refers to. So neuroscience is basically a study of the nervous system. The nervous system refers to a network of neurons all around the body, and we can split this up into the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. So whilst both are important, often in neuroscience, we tend to focus on the central nervous system, which refers to the brain and the spinal cord. And usually it's because this is a lot more complex. There's a lot more that we don't understand about these systems. And they often drive a lot of what the peripheral nerves, which is all the other nerves around the body, what they do. So the brain is one of the most important, if not the most important organ of the body. And it consists of many, many neurons. And actually, what a lot of people don't know is that there are actually 86 billion neurons in the average human brain. So these neurons communicate with each other using synapses, and we can see approximately 100 trillion synapses in the average human brain. So you can imagine there's a lot of communication happening all the time, and they're constantly sending each other electrical currents to allow us to do basically what makes us human on a daily basis. So some of the systems that neuroscience is involved in includes the sensory systems, so that's like touch, pain, vision, smell, taste, or hearing. It's also involved in movement and cognition, which refers to the mental processes such as decision making or memory. So if we take an example, a lot of us would have woken up this morning and we would have decided what we want for breakfast. We would have decided, okay, we want to make a slice of toast, and we would have carried out to make that toast and eaten it. But if we really think about what goes on to help us make the decision, to then coordinate our arms to butter this toast and then to coordinate our jaw to actually eat and appreciate our slice of toast. In the background, there's millions of neurons driving such simple processes on a daily basis. And that is what neuroscience focuses on, how these neurons work and how they drive all the processes that make us human. So moving on to brief anatomy. So we're going to look at the brain from the outside in, and we'll zoom in as we go along to end up looking at the cellular structures. If we look very superficially, we can see that the brain is split up into three main parts. We have the cerebrum, which is the top. We then have the cerebellum at the bottom, and then we have this long elongated process called the brainstem. If we zoom in on the cerebrum, and if we draw a line down the middle of it, we can split it up into the left and the right hemisphere. But another way of looking at the cerebrum is by splitting it up into lobes, with each lobe serving a different function. So if we start with the frontal lobe, it's important for things like higher intellect, so things like making decisions, personality, how impulsive we tend to be, our mood, and language. If we then take the parietal lobe, that's involved in language, spatial orientation, so understanding the position of objects in space, and mathematical calculations. Then the temporal lobe, which sits just below, houses a structure called the hippocampus, which is very important in memory. And often we see patients who have dementia and their hippocampus is often shrunk over time. It also houses the primary auditory cortex, which is involved in hearing. And then finally, at the back, we have the occipital lobe, which is involved in processing vision. If we then move on, I just want to give you an example of a very famous story, which is basically showing us an example of how over the years we've understood how the brain works. So many of you may have heard of the famous story of Phineas Gage. So Phineas Gage was a railroad construction worker in the 1840s in America. And one day, whilst at work, there was an explosive accident due to which a 3 foot long metal rod went straight through his left cheek, behind his left eye, and went straight out of his skull, the other side. But what's interesting about Phineas Gage is that he remained conscious and recovered very well physically after this accident. But what did change is his personality. So before this incident, people thought he was very well-mannered, very reliable, and very hardworking. But after the accident, people thought he became irritable, he became impulsive, and he became angry. He went through a personality change. But what we know now is that Phineas Gage's frontal lobe was probably affected by this accident. And this is one of the first famous cases which show the relationship between brain and behavior. And even now, we often get patients who have had traumatic brain injuries. For example, they've been through car accidents, and we can see that sometimes their personality does change, showing the impact that different parts of the brain can have on who we are as humans. So if we go back to the anatomy, so we've covered the cerebrum. We'll now be looking at the cerebellum. So this is the small structure that sits just below the cerebrum, and it's involved in fine-tuning movement. So that could be, for example, when we're playing the piano or we're painting a picture, for example. And it also involves maintaining posture and balance. Just below the cerebellum, we have this elongated structure called the brainstem, and that's also what connects the brain to the spinal cord below it. And the brainstem can be split up into three structures. We have the midbrain, the pons, and the medulla. And this small structure is extremely important in keeping us alive. So it's involved in things like controlling our breathing, our heart rhythm, making sure we're awake. It also controls our sleep cycle and facial movements on a day-to-day basis. So if we now zoom in, we can start to look at the microanatomy of the brain. So what are the cellular structures that make up all these large anatomy structures? So there are two key cells which are found in the brain. We have neurons and then we have glia. So neurons are probably what a lot of you have heard about. They come in all different shapes and sizes, and they're found all over the brain, all in the spinal cord, as well as around the body. And what they do is they send electrical impulses and signals through each other to try and drive some of the processes that we spoke about. Things like driving signals that are representing sound waves for hearing, or driving signals that represent visual information to interpret what we see. And for example, movement, so they will drive signals to help our arms and legs move in a certain way. And then we have glia, and these are basically the supportive cells which support the neurons. There's different types, and they all have different roles. So we have astrocytes, which help support the neurons for things like nutrition. They also regulate something called the blood-brain barrier, which is basically a wall that separates the brain from the rest of the body. And they recycle things like neurotransmitters, and neurotransmitters are what helps neurons signal to each other. We also have microglia, which are known as the immune cells of the brain. So they help in defending against infection. They help remove debris, which can develop as a result of inflammation or brain injury. We then have oligodendrocytes. So they produce something called myelin. So if you can see in this neuron, there's a body at the top, and then we have this long process called the axon. And these white layers around the axon is myelin, which helps protect the electrical impulse, making it transmit down the neuron quicker and preventing any leakage of electrical signals. So this myelin is produced by oligodendrocytes. And then finally, we have ependymal cells, which produce something called a cerebrospinal fluid, which is basically a fluid that surrounds the brain, preventing it from moving around too much in this case of injury. So very important glial cells, just as important as neurons, but we don't hear about them as much as we hear about neurons, but they are very important in supporting the brain. So neurons communicate with each other using something called a synapse, which you may have heard about. And this is when you get these neurotransmitters, which are chemicals that are transmitted from one neuron to another, and they then trigger an electrical impulse in the receiving neuron. So neurons can form thousands and up to about 10,000 synapses with each other, and they work in conjunction with each other. So if you remember, I said we have 86 billion neurons and trillion synapses. So there's multiple synapses per neuron. And when there's a whole population of neurons interconnected and working together, we can describe it as a neural network. So as I mentioned, there's billions of neurons, and these neural networks are very large and interconnected structures constantly working behind the scenes to deliver processes. So a lot of you will have heard about artificial intelligence and things like ChatGPT, and these have become prominent obviously in the last few years. And a lot of these AI processes are based upon artificial neural networks, and they were first developed as an inspiration of how the brain works. So these artificial neural networks were inspired by biological neural networks, which we see in our brain. So we can actually see a lot of similarities between computing processes and processes that happen in our brain. So for example, artificial neural networks consist of layers which each produce basic mathematical operations to process data, and then they produce an output. And this is very similar to biological neurons, which receive inputs, they process signals, and then they pass outputs via synapses. And they also develop multiple connections, like you can see in this artificial neural network. But the difference is that biological networks are far more complex, and we are actually still working very hard to understand how these networks work in conjunction with each other. And what's interesting is that there's actually a whole new field of neuroscience now, called computational neuroscience, which uses mathematical models and computer simulations to try and understand how the brain networks might work. And this may be interesting for those of you who are interested in maths or computing. Okay, so moving on. So I want to spend the next few minutes giving you an example of a system. So this is an example of a sensory system and how it works within the brain. So the auditory system is how the brain translates sound waves outside the body to something meaningful within our heads. So to begin with, we get sound waves which travel through the passage of the ear canal, and they hit the tympanic membrane, which is also known as the eardrum that you can see here. And these sound waves are mechanical waves which travel through the air, and they cause a vibration of this eardrum. This vibration then translates to these tiny little bones you can see, which are called ossicles, and they make the bones vibrate. And the bones then vibrate and cause this snail shell-like structure called the cochlea to vibrate as well. So it's basically a transmission of the sound wave into a mechanical vibration. Now, the cochlea is a very interesting structure that looks like a snail shell. And if we look at the inside of it, so this is a zoomed in version of the cochlea. We can ignore this part, which is not involved in hearing, it's involved in balance. But this is the cochlea. Inside, there are these 3 windows containing fluid. So when the vibration enters through the bones into the cochlea, it sends a wave of vibration through this fluid. And actually, I think the next one has this. Yeah, so this is just zoomed in. So the wave of vibration travels through the fluid, and it causes this fine membrane called the basilar membrane to move with the wave. Now, what's interesting about the basilar membrane is that different parts of the membrane actually respond to different sound frequencies. So if we take this cochlea and if we unravel it, so if we just pretend we've unwinded the cochlea, we can see that high frequencies of sound are responded to near the base, so this would be here, and low frequency sounds are responded to near the apex. And why this is important is because depending on where the response is picked up in this membrane, along this whole spiral, the brain will know what frequency of sound is being listened to, and that is how we can appreciate things like music or different frequencies of sounds all around us. Now, on top of the membrane, you see these hair cells, and this is a zoomed in version. And the reason they're called hair cells is because they have these protrusions above them called stereocilia. And when the hair cells move, these stereocilia also move along with the vibration. And this causes opening of ion channels within the hair cells to cause an influx of ions such as potassium and calcium. And this is how the electrical signal is generated. So we get an electrical signal generated through this, which is called the auditory nerve. And this auditory nerve will take the electrical signal all the way back to the brain, to the area called the primary auditory cortex, which is where the signals can then be processed, allowing the brain to interpret sound. So, in summary, we have sound waves being translated into mechanical vibrations, being picked up by these stereocilia, and then being translated into electrical signals to be taken back into the brain. And actually, this is very similar to what we see in a lot of sensory systems. So a very similar process occurs in the visual system and how the eyes, what we see is translated into something being processed in the back of our heads, in the occipital lobe. Very similar process is seen in the olfactory system, which refers to the system of smell. So we have specialized cells within the nose, which respond to different types of smell in the environment. And then a very similar process is seen in touch. So we have special cells all over our skin which respond to touch, and electrical signals are then taken back to the brain. So as you can see, it's a very fine developed structure to help us interpret what's going on around in the environment. And this is just sensory systems. We then have movement systems, which is basically doing things the other way around. So signals are being produced in the brain to allow the arms, the legs, the mouth to move in a certain way. So that is just an example of how a system works within the brain. But if we can appreciate there are not just one, but tens of thousands of systems all happening at the same time, which is why we need billions of neurons to all act in conjunction and in sync with one another at the same time. So that is a very quick whistle-stop tour of anatomy of the brain, the cell structures within the brain, and an example of a system, the hearing auditory system, and how it responds to sound waves around us. I want to now do a quick quiz. So I think Pravaya, at this point we can unmute, or maybe we can use the chat. I'm going to be asking questions.
We need to use the chat, Priya.
Okay, no worries. So I'm just gonna stop sharing for a second so I can see the chat. Okay, so I'll be saying some questions and please just try and respond in the chat, and I'll actually type them into the chat too if it makes it easier. So the first question is, which lobe of the cerebrum holds the structure which is important for memory? And if you remember, I discussed that this structure can be affected in patients with dementia. Yes, so actually it is the hippocampus, but that sits within the temporal lobe, so Milo is correct. The structure is, the hippocampus is not the lobe, it's the structure within the lobe. Okay. Let's move on. Well done. To the next question. Which lobe is involved in vision processing? Yep. Perfect. Okay. Right. Next one, which lobe is involved in decision making? Any ideas? Yeah, frontal lobe. So if you can remember Phineas Gage, any higher thinking, higher intellect is often the frontal lobe. Yeah, perfect. Okay, let's move on to some of the cells. So which glial cell acts as the immune cell of the brain? That's actually not astrocytes. Does anyone want to try again? Yep, microglia. There we go. Yep, so microglia are classically known as the immune cells of the brain. Right. Which glial cell produces myelin sheath? If you remember that, the role of myelin sheath. Mm-hmm. Okay, now could somebody tell me what is the role of myelin? Yeah, brilliant. Okay. Right, next question. Which membrane is part of the cochlea and acts to interpret sound waves? Yeah, okay, that's the bit of a trick question. It is the basilar membrane, but the tympanic isn't wrong because it's also part of that's the eardrum. That's a bit earlier on. Brilliant. Okay, and which cells are involved in converting the vibration to electrical impulses? Typing it out. Yeah, so stereocilia are not the cells, they are the structures on the cells. So we have hair, they're called hair cells, and the protrusions on them refers to the cilia. Perfect. Okay, that is actually all my questions. So does anybody have any questions for me? Any questions about medicine or biomedical sciences? Okay, so why did you decide to go into the field of neuroscience? Um, so as I tried to describe today, I think neuroscience is involved in almost everything we do on a daily basis. And not only does that involve physical things like sensory systems and movement systems, but also psychology and mental processes. There's a lot of things, a lot of parts of neuroscience that are still very um, not very well understood. So I think there's a lot of scope for research in the field. And as a doctor, when we see patients who are affected by diseases of the neurological system, we actually see that their lives change completely. So if we just take the example of the auditory system, when we see people lose hearing, lose vision, become paralyzed, for example, we can see that it can impact their lives, it can impact their personality, as we spoke about Phineas Gage. So I think it can be a very, it can really help you appreciate the importance of the neurosystem, especially as a doctor. So that's why I decided to go into the field of neuroscience. What made you decide to go into research rather than solely medicine? So I think solely medicine can often be sometimes very repetitive, but also it can be quite tough. It's a lot of long hours, a lot of night shifts, a lot of on calls. So it's nice to have some time off clinical work to read around, to read papers, to do research. And I think doing both really helps you appreciate both sides of medicine. And it helps you translate your research into your life as a doctor because you can understand what's going on, the latest in research, the newest drugs, and things like that. Is there a relationship between neuroscience and psychology at all? Yep. So when I did my master's in neuroscience, we did a whole module on cognitive neuroscience, which is things like mental health, um, how we make decisions, what drives us to make certain decisions. So that was all very psychology based. Of course, you can do a purely psychology based course, but definitely within neuroscience, cognitive neuroscience appreciates a lot of those sorts of processes. And yeah, we learned a lot about depression, anxieties, things like schizophrenia, so mental health disorders. Since people with autism and ADHD are more sensitive to certain sounds, how is this different to a stereotypical nervous system? Oh, that's quite a difficult question. From what I know, I don't think the structure of their auditory system is any different. I imagine it's something, so the cochlea will be the same, the nerves will be the same, but it's probably how they interpret sounds higher up, so in the auditory cortex, that makes them more sensitive, is what I think is probably true, but I'm not an expert on autism and ADHD. I imagine the structure it's not a physical structure difference. What's the stress level? Stress level of neuroscience or being a doctor? I guess it depends on what you're asking. What induces the differences in people's music tastes? That's a very interesting question, and it's probably something that we don't completely understand. So people do think we probably do perceive sound in slightly different ways because some people's hair cells will be you lose hair cells over time as you age, but also when we go to loud concerts, you can lose hair cells. So that means that some people may not appreciate certain frequencies of sounds as well as others, especially people who are elderly and they've lost a lot of their hair cells. Music taste is probably a combination of memory. So often we link certain songs to certain memories within our brain, as well as how we interpret sound. So it's probably very complex, and that's very true for a lot of neuroscience systems. They're also, because everything works in conjunction, we don't really have a lot of answers for why things are the way they are, but that's a very interesting question. What is your least favorite part of your job? Oh, I think being a doctor can be a lot of long hours, but you do get used to it. So you get some days off when you've done like a set of night shifts. So it's probably my least favorite, but it's not the worst thing ever. I think you get used to it with time. How much work did you do on neuroscience during your medical course at Imperial? That's a good question. So halfway through a medical course at Imperial, and this is also true at Oxford, you do a intercalated bachelor's course. So at Imperial it's a BSc, and I think at Oxford it's a BA, but I'm not completely sure. But I know it's a bachelor's, and you can choose what topic you do that on. So I did mine on neuroscience, but there's a vast range of options. You can do it in respiratory medicine, endocrinology, which is like the medicine of hormones, bioengineering, you could do Imperial. Anatomy is an option at some universities. And I know at Oxford you can also do it on neuroscience. So yeah, you get a whole year dedicated to a theme that you're interested in, and it's also an opportunity to do research. So that's probably the first time I was introduced to research. So it's a very, very good opportunity. Is the theoretical part of neuroscience overlapping with the study for neurosurgery? Yes. So the anatomy is extreme. It's the bread and butter of neurosurgery is understanding the anatomy. But along with the anatomy, you need to understand the function of all the anatomical structures because you'll be doing surgery on those anatomical structures. So you need to understand if this part is affected in the surgery, how will this translate into how the patient is affected when they wake up from the surgery? So the anatomy and the function of structures is very important. I So that kind of is like, for example, what we just spoke about, the auditory system. You need to understand how the cochlea works, where the nerve runs, because it's at risk when you're doing surgery around that area. Things like cellular systems, it's good to know, but it's probably not as important as the anatomy. With a master's degree in neuroscience, could you go into neuropathology? Absolutely, yep. You can do, a lot of people from our course went on to do more research, PhDs. They went on to do medicine if they haven't already done it. Some people went to do sort of consulting. Some people are working in like government policies for healthcare. So very broad range of things that you can do after sort of even a bachelor's degree in science. I think all those options would still hold true. Why did you pick Oxford for your master's? So Oxford is very, very well known for the neuroscience department. Um, there's We had an option of over 100 research projects that we could pick from to work on. So I think that's probably very little universities that have that much choice. And it went from wet labs, so working with microscopes, all the way to working with patients, such a big range of labs available. So I think that was perfect. That was probably the main reason why I chose Oxford. I've just remembered I actually have a slide on resources, so I'll share that in a second. Next question, how would a surgeon navigate the brain to remove a tumor without causing any serious effects such as paralysis? That's a very good question. So they often use imaging, so things like MRI scans, which is the big tube that patients go in, to really try to localize exactly where the tumor is. But now there's even more specialized scanning systems. There's something called stereotactic radiosurgery, which is where they use specialized systems to really navigate exactly where the tumor is before they even go in to the brain. Sometimes people do awake craniotomy, which is when they keep the patient awake and every time they do a part of the surgery, they'll stop to check that the patient is still okay. So, for example, whether they can still talk, if they worry that they might affect the language part of the brain. But one of my resources is actually a good book about neurosurgery, so I'll talk about that in a second. Is it possible to go into neuroscience at uni if only you have psychology at A level? I think it's probably worth looking at the Oxford, if it's Oxford or wherever you are interested in. They often say which A levels they require. I would imagine most of them would require biology, but I wouldn't exclude it completely because psychology is very relevant to neuroscience. So all courses will say which A levels they require. Which recent research in neuroscience have you done that's impressed you lots? Okay, so as part of my master's in neuroscience, I was working with Parkinson's patients. Parkinson's is a neurodegenerative disorder which people get, which causes things like tremor. They can't walk as well. Over time, they lose their memory, and it can really impact someone's life. And I was looking at how we can use wearable sensors, so basically like devices which are like Apple Watches, to monitor their disease over time. So we were using the data from a sort of sensor that was on the wrist to try and monitor how their disease was progressing over time. And I think as a doctor, I think that's the future, trying to monitor patients without them having to come into the hospital every few weeks. And I think as technology is progressing, we're really going towards that, not just in Parkinson's, but in stroke medicine, dementia, multiple sclerosis, so a lot of other neurological diseases as well. What would be the best pathway to become a neurologist or a neurosurgeon? So I'm training to be a neurologist. So I think obviously doing medicine it's always useful to do research because these are very research heavy specialist fields. And I think the master's in neuroscience was a huge stepping stone for me into the world of research. But it's very much it will put you apart from the rest of the crowd who have done only medicine. But I guess at your stage, you should focus on getting into medicine and trying to get interested in research from the start of your university days. So just speak to your lecturers and things like that to try and get into research. What did you do for your A levels and what were your grades? Oh gosh, okay. So it was like 10 to 15 years ago. I think for my I levels I did biology, chemistry, maths, and history. And my grades were, I think, A star, A. But I think that obviously that was a long time ago. I think the dynamic has changed now, competition ratios have changed. I'd say with medicine, it's very much about your UK CAT and BMAT. I'm not sure if they're still around. And they also put a lot of weight on your personal statements. So it's not just about your grades. I think there's a lot of other factors which can really help push up your applications. Do you have any interesting book recommendations? Yes, I do. So I'll share that slide. I can share it now, actually. Let me just go through these questions. Um, what kind of research are you focusing on right now? So right now I'm working on that Parkinson's project, and I'm also working with dementia patients, and we're using a specialized scanning system to try and pick up dementia patients early on, so we can sort of pick up the disease before patients even become symptomatic. So that's what I'm working on. What are your thoughts on the morality and potential of using living neurons to carry out tasks in a similar way as is being explored and used? Well, that's a very heavy question. Um, I think we're very far away from being able to do that because it's very difficult to produce neurons from scratch. Um, if we were to do that, I think it would have to be very careful because the potential could be, of course, just like, I guess, just similar as an artificial intelligence. How does the frontal lobe create someone's personality, and to what extent do external factors contribute to it? So, again, that is something that we do not fully understand, but we do believe that the structures within the frontal lobe, so there's a structure called the prefrontal cortex, um, is very involved in how impulsive we are, um, how addictive our behavior is, and things like that. How this happens, again, is combination of probably nature and nurture. So probably a combination of genetic factors as well as the environment that we've been around whilst growing up. But our understanding of this is extremely limited, and that's why neuroscience is so exciting. Resources I will share in a minute. What is a job in neuroscience research like? Is it primarily lab-based or does it depend? Research very much depends on which lab you're a part of. So, for example, if you're working in molecular research, you'll be spending probably a lot of time within the lab, either using cultured dishes with neurons or under the microscope. Whereas if you're doing clinical research, some days you might be with patients doing testing, other days you might be working with data. So there will probably be a lot of lab days, but other days will be processing your data, carrying out statistics. So there's a lot of maths involved in research to try and process what you've picked up during your testing. And then there's also a lot of presenting. So I've traveled to a lot of conferences to present my work. I went to New York in the summer to present. So that's one of the pros of research. You do get to travel. But of course, it comes with a lot of work behind the scenes. But that is a big pro. How challenging are the core courses in neuroscience, and what strategies can I use to succeed in them? I think neuroscience is challenging in the sense that it combines biology, chemistry, psychology, maths, and physics. But it's definitely something that you can wrap your head around. There's so many resources, and if you're doing a degree or a course, then you just take it slowly to try to understand what strategies can I use to succeed in them. There are some resources that I will share, but actually, when I was at your stage, I was just reading a lot of books, like which I will share. That was just developing my interest in neuroscience. So you don't necessarily have to like fully understand the topic right now, but if you just develop your interest, it will help you understand whether you really do like the topic. And also understanding the anatomy from the start will really help you appreciate how systems work. If you had to pick a different university to study at, where would you have gone if you had to pick a different course? And have you got any final tips to applying to medicine? Um, I don't know if it's very difficult to know which other university. I I think when you're choosing your university, it should be a combination of the course, which cities you'd want to be in, how far you'd want to be from home, or how close you'd want to be from home. I think there's so many different factors. Um, I think it doesn't with medicine, I think most universities in the UK that provide a medical degree are all very well renowned. So certainly when I'm working as a doctor, um, it doesn't really matter too much, but like which, for example, which university you've gone on. But like I said, it's a lot of personal factors that you should take into account, like where you'd want to study, where you'd want to live, and things like that. And have you got any final tips for applying to medicine? I think it can be a very grueling application, but I think just hang in there. Make sure you work hard for your BMATs and UK CATs if you're sitting those, and um, grades are important as well as other things. So make sure you show off other parts of your life, whether that's, any sports that you've excelled in, any other hobbies like art, any charity work you've done. Don't try to think about all the other aspects of your life other than just your grades, because they want to see people who are holistic, and particularly as people who are going to be doctors around patients. People who are holistic is really valuable for applying to medicine. And I think those links should be really good. Um, if I want to do an undergraduate in biomedical science and do research in the future, is it worth getting work experience at hospitals? Absolutely. So I did do that when I was at your age. Um, it's very much worth doing work experience if it's possible. I think it is a bit harder nowadays to get those opportunities, but if you can, definitely it gives you insight into whether you enjoy it as well. Do you work in a hospital more often or neurology? Yes, so I do 2/3 of my year are in the hospital and 1/3 of my year is lab work. That's because I'm doing a part-time research position, but most people are doing full-time hospital work as a doctor. So, but there are options to do something like this. There's also options to teach. So we teach medical students. We can do research, we can do presentations, and then there's obviously the hospital work. So there's a very good variety of work, which is great as well. What are the main differences between biomedical sciences and medicine as a degree? So yeah, I think Prova's put the link, but from I obviously did medicine, which is a longer degree because we have the clinical years where we have to go into hospitals to do placements, and that's true for Oxford as well. Whereas biomedical sciences, you don't have to do those clinical years because you're not training to be a doctor. I think that's the main difference. So I'm just going to share my slides again now to share the resources page. So for anatomy, these are the 3 websites which I found really useful. Teach Me Anatomy, I used that all the way throughout university as well. So that's really great, not just for neuroanatomy, but anatomy of the whole body. Brain Fact is a really good website which has a 3D model of the brain to help you understand how structures are, and you can sort of move around the structure and really appreciate what the brain looks like. Osmosis is another website that I used all the way throughout university for medicine, not only for anatomy, but also for biological sciences, clinical systems, how things work. It's really good resource. So these are just some of the books. So when I was around your stage, I was reading a lot of books about brain and about the neuroscience, and just these are just a few of them, and it really helped produce an interest in me for how the brain works. And these are like they're easy reads, but they also go into some science of the brain. So I would really recommend these books, but also these authors have written a few other books, so they're good ways to start. And then these are some websites which give you some more insight into how neural systems work. So not necessarily anatomy, but how the visual system works, how the auditory system works, which is very much what we did as first and second year medical students. You get taught about how the neural systems work. So that's quite useful. And then again, this YouTube page, Khan Academy, is really great for understanding how neurosystems work. And I, again, use that all the way throughout my medical degree. Okay, if you guys want to take a screenshot, I'm going to stop sharing to see if there's any more questions. I think that's it. There doesn't seem to be any other questions in the chat.